My husband locked the door and left me inside as his party began in our living room. As if I were an obstacle that had to be hidden to avoid ruining the perfect image he wanted to project to his guests. From the bedroom, I could hear the music swell, glasses clinking, and laughter filling the space I had helped prepare for days, coordinating details, moving furniture, and confirming vendors, because he had asked for my help without telling me that he planned to disappear from the scene that night. Sitting on the edge of the bed, still wearing the dress I had so excitedly chosen, I understood that it wasn't just about a locked door, but about years of feeling small so that he could feel important. As they toasted to his success, I took a deep breath and opened the closet with a newfound calm. I took out a suitcase and packed my clothes along with important documents and something else that would change the course of this story. When the music stopped and the door opened again, the surprise wasn't in the party anymore. It was in my decision. That night it wasn't an impulse. It was the culmination of many years in which I adjusted my own dreams so that his career could advance smoothly. When we married, we both worked and talked about growing together, but little by little, my goals were put on hold because someone had to support the household while he accepted every new project that promised recognition and higher income. I turned down a significant promotion because it involved travel, and according to him, it would affect his concentration. I dropped courses halfway through because the schedules didn't align with his meetings. I adjusted my schedule to be available when he needed support, even when it meant spending entire nights reviewing presentations, proofreading texts, and organizing events that he later claimed as his own achievements. I was always the one who handled unexpected problems, who spoke with suppliers, who kept the accounts in order to avoid delays. I was the one who stretched the budget when a deal didn't go as planned, the one who cut personal expenses so he could invest in his professional image. Meanwhile, his speeches to friends and colleagues spoke of individual effort, discipline, and vision, as if it had all come from nothing. Over time, financial control began to shift quietly. Big decisions required her approval first, even though I was the one managing the finances. Accounts started to be centralized under her pretext of simplification, and any questioning would escalate into an argument where I always felt like I was overreacting. She said I should trust her, that everything she did was for our future, that stability depended on maintaining a certain image in front of influential people. There were also comments that seemed small but left their mark. Opinions about what I wore to important meetings, suggestions that I stay in the background so as not to disrupt the proceedings, jokes in front of others that portrayed me as sensitive or impractical. Laughing at myself became a strategy to avoid tension, even though inside each joke weighed heavily. The house she so proudly displayed as a symbol of success was maintained with countless unseen hours of work. Every event she organized involved countless calls and negotiations that I undertook without expecting applause, convinced that shared recognition would come eventually. However, the scene at that party made it clear that his concept of success didn't include my presence when it might interfere with the narrative he wanted to construct. I understood then that the confinement wasn't an isolated act, but the most blatant version of a pattern that had been growing for some time. For years I accepted giving up space, believing it was part of a shared project, without noticing that little by little my voice was becoming smaller within my own life. That night, while the music continued to play and I finished packing my suitcase, I understood that sacrifice ceased to be love when it began to erase me. Closing that suitcase didn't immediately erase everything I had experienced, but as I folded each garment, memories began to parade by. Memories I had tried to minimize for years to avoid accepting the obvious. The party wasn't an isolated incident. It was the clearest version of a story that had been built with small gestures of contempt that I learned to disguise as insignificant details. There were dinners with business partners where he asked me to change my mind in front of everyone so as not to contradict him, even though the original idea had been mine. At family gatherings, she would often tell anecdotes where I came across as clumsy or exaggerated, provoking laughter that seemed harmless but left me silent for the rest of the night. More than once, I heard her tell me I should be grateful for my stability and not complicate things with insecurities. On one occasion, he organized an important meeting, and after weeks of working together, he introduced me as someone who had only helped with minor details. That remark stung, but I chose to smile so as not to spoil the atmosphere. Another afternoon, when I suggested investing in something in my name to balance responsibilities, he replied that there was no need to divide what was already well managed, implying that questioning things was a lack of trust. Important decisions began to be communicated as fait accompli. Changes in investments, financial commitments, agreements with third parties. Everything reached me when there was no longer any room for input. If I showed discomfort, the conversation shifted to my character, not to the substance of the matter. I ended up doubting my own judgment, as if asking for clarity were a mistake. Comparisons disguised as advice also surfaced. Comments about colleagues' wives who knew how to remain discreet, who understood the importance of not interfering. Repeated stories about couples who supported without question. Each example implied that my value lay in silent accompaniment. There were celebrations where she posed for photos while I stayed out of the frame under the pretext of attending to pending matters. Messages I answered secretly during family dinners, which when questioned turned into accusations of distrust. Promises of time together that were always postponed due to urgent commitments related to her image. With each episode, I learned to shrink to avoid bigger conflicts. I adjusted my tone, measured my words, and chose battles that never came to fruition. The feeling of walking on shaky ground became routine, and the idea that I was exaggerating began to settle in like a constant shadow. Locking myself in during the party was the only act that dispelled any doubt. That locked door symbolized all the times my opinion was left out, all the occasions when my presence was uncomfortable, because I didn't fit the role she had decided to assign me. As the sound of the music continued to filter through the walls, I understood that I wasn't facing a fleeting moment, but rather the reflection of a pattern that wasn't going to change on its own. That day I understood that something had to change. Accepting that something had to change didn't come with shouting or desperate demands. It arrived with a serenity that even surprised me as I finished packing my things in my suitcase and listened to the distant echo of the celebration that continued downstairs as if nothing were happening. At another time, I would have gone downstairs to confront him, demanded respect in front of everyone, or knocked on the door until someone noticed I was gone. But that night I understood that any public scene would only feed the version he always wanted to project, that of an emotional woman incapable of controlling her impulses. I wasn't willing to give him that narrative. I took a deep breath and looked around the room carefully, as if I were seeing it for the last time from a different perspective. Every object had a story. Every piece of furniture represented hours of shared work. And yet, none of them justified continuing to accept such a small place in my own life. I felt a mixture of sadness and clarity, a firm feeling that didn't need noise to sustain itself. I didn't cry. I didn't argue, I didn't go down to demand explanations. I simply continued packing what I needed with precise movements, reviewing important documents, taking photographs of papers I had managed for years and knew better than anyone. My calm wasn't resignation, it was strategy. While choosing what to take and what to leave behind, I mentally reviewed every recent financial decision, every signed contract, every investment made under the guise of simplifying processes. I knew where the backups were, I knew the dates, and I understood the structure better than anyone because for a long time I had been the one who organized everything behind the scenes. That clarity gave me a different kind of strength. I didn't need to confront him in that moment to reclaim my dignity. It was enough to act with intelligence and patience. I lowered the volume of my emotions and raised the level of my focus. If I had learned for years to maintain complex structures without recognition, I could also dismantle them without a scene. The music began to fade, a sign that the night was drawing to a close. I imagined smiles, goodbyes, comments about how successful the meeting had been. I thought about how I would climb the stairs with that confidence I always displayed after impressing others. I had no idea that the real action was happening far from my view. I firmly closed my suitcase and packed more than just clothes and documents in my bag. I packed determination. It wasn't just about leaving because of wounded pride. It was about protecting my future with the same dedication I had shown for years in protecting theirs. I understood that silence can be more powerful than any argument when it's backed by well-thought-out actions. Before turning off the light, I looked around the room one last time and felt that for the first time in a long time, I was making a decision that was entirely my own. That night didn't mark a dramatic ending. It marked the beginning of a plan that would change every dynamic I had accepted without question. Leaving that house didn't mean starting from scratch, because for years I had learned to observe carefully and move discreetly within a system I myself had helped to build. While many thought I was just there to support them, I was actually the one who understood every number, every contract, and every signature that upheld the image of success they so proudly displayed. Back when they started centralizing accounts under the guise of simplifying processes, I made sure to maintain digital backups and physical copies of key documents, not out of distrust, but out of professional habit. Managing meant anticipating risks. Among those documents were investment agreements, property deeds, and financial records that clearly showed who was actually managing the resources. There was also a detail that always escaped his notice. One of the properties acquired in the early years was registered in my name on the accountant's advice. At the time, it seemed like a minor formality, something temporary that would be changed later. It never was. Over time, that property increased in value and became a strategic asset in his business portfolio, even though legally it remained mine. Furthermore, part of the income generated by projects I coordinated was deposited into a separate account I opened with his initial knowledge to facilitate payments to suppliers. That account remained active and well organized, with clear and verifiable transactions. What seemed like a simple operational channel was actually a solid foundation demonstrating my direct involvement in every financial achievement. I didn't need to invent anything or exaggerate situations. The information spoke for itself. I had access to emails acknowledging my management, messages where I requested specific instructions, and shared files that evidenced joint decisions. For a long time, I kept everything as administrative backup, never imagining that one day it would prove my role was never secondary. That night, reviewing the documents in my bag again, I understood that strength lay not in an impulsive reaction, but in a detailed understanding of the structure he thought he controlled single-handedly. Each file represented a piece of the puzzle that could change the public and private narrative. It wasn't about destroying things in anger, but about balancing a scale that had been tilted for years. While he celebrated his ability to impress, I held information capable of redefining responsibilities, roles, and rights. The security I felt didn't stem from a desire for revenge, but from the certainty that I was no longer unprotected. As I closed my bag, I knew I wasn't leaving as a victim, improvising my next move. I was leaving with legal, financial, and strategic tools that could reshape every established dynamic. What he had always considered silent support was about to become the factor that would completely change his perspective. The story I presented that night as an example of individual success had shared foundations, and I was ready to demonstrate it at the appropriate moment. Upon leaving the house, I didn't seek comfort or tell my side of the story to family members. I went straight to protecting every step I was about to take. I spent the night in a discreet hotel, and first thing the next morning, I made an appointment with a lawyer specializing in estate law, whom a friend had recommended years before, when I still believed I would never need personal advice. I arrived with an organized folder, digital backups, and a clear list of facts. I didn't speak from a place of pain. I spoke from a place of data. I explained how the accounts worked, who managed contracts, which property was registered in my name, and what recent transactions could affect my legal standing. The lawyer listened attentively, and while reviewing documents, he confirmed something he already suspected. My position was stronger than he imagined. We immediately initiated preventative measures. The ownership of the property still registered in my name was formally notified. A review of certain transfers was requested, and any attempt to modify them without my authorization was blocked. This was not an attack. It was legitimate protection. Every step was supported by clear procedures, and within the legal framework, that a request was also sent to audit projects where my signature appeared as the administrative manager. This required transparency regarding figures for third parties and documented my direct involvement. The narrative of individual success began to clash with official records that revealed a shared structure. Meanwhile, I changed digital access to accounts where I had authority, updated passwords, and activated notifications for any relevant activity. I didn't raise my voice or send impulsive messages. Everything was handled formally and with precise timing. I understood that the best response wasn't to express anger, but to act intelligently and firmly. Hours later, the first effect began to be noticeable. He tried to carry out a transaction related to the strategic property, and the system flagged a restriction due to ownership. At the same time, he received notification of an administrative review on projects he considered closed. There was no scandal, just procedures activated. I imagined his surprise at encountering limitations where he had previously operated with absolute confidence. For years, he had thought he had total control, without realizing that each structure had a clear legal basis. That sense of security, built on the idea that I would never react, began to crumble without any direct confrontation. That afternoon, I didn't answer calls or messages. I knew he would try to understand what was happening. I preferred to let the documents speak for themselves. The serenity with which I made each decision contrasted sharply with the image he always projected of me. There was no drama, only strategy. The phrase I silently repeated while signing the last papers was simple and powerful. The best revenge isn't shouting, it's acting. The reaction wasn't long in coming, although it wasn't a direct confrontation as many might imagine. First came the awkward silence, then the insistent attempts to communicate, and finally the messages, which no longer had their usual confident tone. Something was amiss in his perfectly calculated world, and for the first time he didn't have absolute control of the situation. He tried to close a major deal related to an investment that depended on the property registered in my name, but the transaction was halted by the legal notification confirming my sole ownership. The process couldn't move forward without my formal authorization, and that authorization simply didn't exist. The surprise was even greater when they discovered that an administrative review had also been initiated on projects where my involvement was documented. The cards linked to shared accounts began to show limited transactions, not on a whim, but due to preventative adjustments we requested to protect assets under review. There was no public outcry at the time, but a chain of obstacles unraveled the image of stability I so carefully cultivated with partners and acquaintances. I received a message asking if I was exaggerating, if all of this was necessary, if we couldn't talk privately to resolve misunderstandings. The narrative shifted from confidence to bewilderment in a matter of hours. The person who had locked me in to avoid ruining their event was now urgently seeking explanations. Some colleagues began noticing delays in authorizations that had previously been processed quickly. Certain decisions were put on hold because they required joint signatures or clarifications regarding the legal structure. The domino effect unfolded without shouting or threats, solely supported by formal procedures already underway. That afternoon, while reviewing updates with the lawyer, I knew the impact was just beginning. It wasn't about destroying his career, but about forcing him to acknowledge that the story wasn't built on a single will. Every document activated represented a clear boundary. Every official notification was a sign that the balance had shifted. The calls increased in intensity. He went from disbelief to annoyance, and from annoyance to an apparent concern for fixing things. However, I was no longer driven by guilt or the fear of appearing confrontational. The calm that had emerged that night remained intact, now reinforced by visible results. Uncomfortable questions began to surface in his circle. Why were certain transactions on hold? What did the administrative review mean? Why did a key property have a different ownership than everyone assumed? These weren't rumors. They were verifiable facts that demanded explanation. The scenario I had so carefully constructed began to show cracks, and the most revealing thing was realizing that I didn't need to make a fuss for the impact to be felt. The first fall was not a public scandal, it was the silent loss of control that he valued so much. The tension that had begun quietly finally erupted when one of the main partners called an urgent meeting to clarify the situation regarding the stalled projects and the property, whose ownership was in question. It wasn't an informal gathering. Investors, advisors, and people who for years had heard the story that all the growth had been the result of impeccable individual effort were present. I agreed to attend, accompanied by my lawyer, not to create a spectacle, but to present information clearly and concisely. As I entered the room, I felt surprised stares because many had assumed my role had always been secondary. The expectation was palpable. They wanted to understand why certain transactions were blocked, and what the recent legal notifications meant. The conversation began with technical questions. There was talk of pending authorizations, financial transactions under review, and the official registration of the strategic property. At that point, my lawyer asked to speak and presented documents confirming my ownership, along with signed administrative management reports and emails acknowledging my direct involvement in key decisions. The atmosphere changed immediately. It was no longer a domestic matter. It was a legal reality before witnesses who understood the weight of each document. Some reviewed printed copies, others watched silently as records were projected showing that my name appeared on relevant contracts. There were no emotional accusations, only orderly evidence. He tried to downplay the situation, arguing that it was all part of an internal dynamic, but the dates, signatures, and transfers spoke for themselves. The administrative review wasn't a whim. It was a valid procedure stemming from my formal role within the organization. Every piece of information dismantled the narrative of absolute control I had maintained for years. Those who had previously seen me as an accomplice began to evaluate me from a different perspective. They understood that this wasn't a personal conflict, but a deliberate omission of relevant information. The discomfort in the room was palpable, not because of a scandal, but because of the clarity with which a truth many were unaware of was exposed. At the end of the meeting, it was established that any future decisions would require my formal authorization, and that transparency would be mandatory to continue with existing agreements. There were no shouts or insults, but there was an implicit acknowledgement that the structure couldn't stand without my involvement. Leaving that room was different from leaving the house that night. This time I wasn't carrying a suitcase. I was carrying the certainty that the truth was no longer locked away in a room. It was backed by documents, presented to those who valued credibility the most. After that meeting, it became clear that the situation couldn't be resolved with improvised explanations, so the next step was to formalize everything with the appropriate authorities, so that every right and responsibility would be clearly defined, leaving no room for convenient interpretations. What had functioned for years with verbal agreements and unequal trust now had to be supported by legal clarity. The process began with the official request for separation of assets and a complete review of property acquired during the marriage. We submitted bank statements, contracts, investment receipts, and property deeds. Each document was analyzed in detail to determine the actual percentages of ownership and effective management. It wasn't about winning out of pride, but about establishing a fair distribution based on verifiable facts. The audit of projects where my signature appeared as manager was also included. This review confirmed that my involvement was not merely decorative, but structural. Working hours, administrative decisions, and financial coordination were all documented in reports that refuted any attempt to minimize my contribution. During the formal hearings, he tried to soften his stance, arguing that he always acted in the best interests of the marriage and that decisions were made by mutual agreement. However, the dates and bank statements showed instances where he failed to report significant changes affecting shared assets. This omission carried weight with the relevant authorities. The strategic property legally registered in my name was recognized as my sole property, which completely altered the financial plan he had presented to the partners. Certain investments had to be restructured, and others were suspended until responsibilities were clarified. His image of absolute control ultimately clashed with a solid case against him. The preliminary ruling established clear measures, equitable division of jointly acquired assets, formal recognition of my participation in projects, and an obligation to make pending financial transactions transparent. There was no room for ambiguity or last-minute informal agreements. Everything was in writing. Hearing those resolutions didn't fill me with euphoria, but rather a profound calm. For years I had doubted my place in that story, and now a formal instance confirmed that my contribution carried real weight. It wasn't an emotional version. It was a truth backed by documents and procedures. As I left the office where the first decisions were communicated, I understood that justice doesn't always arrive with applause. It arrives with signed documents that change structures. What began with a closed door ended up opening a process where my voice was officially and definitively recorded. When the resolutions began to be made official and the changes became irreversible, a different version of him emerged, one he didn't show to partners or acquaintances. There was no longer a firm tone or absolute certainty. Now she spoke of memories, of promises made at the beginning of our marriage, and of everything that, according to her account, we had built together with love and shared effort. She requested a private meeting, arguing that she preferred to resolve everything away from lawyers and formalities. She claimed that the legal process was damaging her image, and that we could reach a more humane agreement if I withdrew certain demands. She tried to appeal to nostalgia, mentioning trips, celebrations, and moments where it seemed our support was mutual. She also insinuated that my reaction was disproportionate, that an honest conversation would have been enough to avoid greater consequences. She spoke of communication breakdowns, work pressure, and accumulated stress. She presented herself as someone who lost control due to external circumstances, not conscious decisions. Listening to that speech allowed me to understand something clearly. For years, the manipulation wasn't always aggressive. Many times it came wrapped in gentle words that sought to awaken guilt. That strategy had worked before because I myself preferred to preserve the idea of a shared project rather than face the discomfort of questioning it. However, now the perspective was different. I didn't respond out of anger or a desire to hurt. I responded with firmness. I explained that the process wasn't a punishment, but a natural consequence of accumulated actions. I pointed out that any agreement had to remain within the established legal framework, and that I wouldn't withdraw applications that protected my participation and my future. She tried to shift the focus and spoke of reputation, of how certain rumors could affect her professional environment if the conflict became public. She suggested that it was best to close the matter quickly to avoid external commentary. This concern wasn't about rebuilding trust, but about limiting the public impact. My response was clear and understated. I wasn't seeking unnecessary exposure, but neither would I accept agreements that would once again obscure my role. If transparency raised questions, those questions had to be answered with facts, not convenient silences. By the end of the conversation, it was clear that she no longer had any influence over my decisions. The person who had once doubted herself now spoke with confidence, without raising her voice and without needing to justify herself. The manipulation lost its effect because it no longer found fertile ground. I closed that chapter without hatred or any intention of revenge. I understood that the real break didn't happen when I left with my suitcase. It happened when I stopped accepting narratives that minimized my worth. From that moment on, any attempt to return to the past was no longer possible. With the process underway and the resolutions clear, I began to build a new chapter, free from the constant burden of proving my value. The property registered in my name ceased to be a piece of their financial strategy and became the foundation of my independence. I decided to transform it into a functional space to develop my own projects, reviving skills that had been neglected for years. I reorganized my finances with professional advice and opened new accounts under transparent systems. I invested in training to update my knowledge and expand job opportunities that I had previously postponed to prioritize other people's goals. Every decision was guided by a simple question. This strengthens my stability and peace of mind. The change wasn't immediate or perfect, but it was constant that I rekindled friendships I had neglected, established clear boundaries in family conversations, and learned to say no without guilt. I discovered that self-respect doesn't stem from noisy confrontations, but from consistency between thoughts and actions. Over time, the world stopped talking about the conflict and began to acknowledge results. Projects initiated under my leadership started generating stable income, backed by clear contracts and visible involvement. I no longer worked in the shadows. Every achievement was transparently credited to me. The peace I found didn't come from seeing him face consequences, but from feeling whole without depending on external validation. I understood that true success isn't measured by impressing at a party, but by living with dignity and balance. Looking back, I realized that the worst betrayal wasn't that night he locked me in while he celebrated downstairs. The deepest wound was accepting a diminished role for years out of fear of making others uncomfortable. The day I decided to stop was the beginning of my authentic life. Today, my home is a space where my presence doesn't get in the way, where decisions are made clearly, and where respect isn't optional. I learned that a healthy family is built on dialogue and fairness, not appearances. I also confirmed that self-love isn't selfishness. It's the foundation for any relationship that aspires to be just. If there's one thing I can share with anyone who hears this story, it's that strategic silence can be more powerful than any argument, but only when it leads to firm action. No one deserves to feel invisible in their own life. Change begins when you recognize your own worth and act accordingly. If this experience resonated with you, subscribe and share, because talking about dignity and respect can help more people find the moment to open their own door to a new chapter.